I'm delighted to welcome Dame Sarah Thornton to the Scotland Against Modern Slavery podcast. This is an absolutely fantastic honour to have, and I'm delighted to showcase you, the independent anti-slavery commissioner, to the viewers in Scotland who are watching on YouTube or listening on SoundCloud. So, thank you so much. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It was a very kind and generous introduction.
Thank you very much. Well, I am genuine. I'm moved, and it's Scotland Against Modern Slavery seems to be gathering momentum and steam, and everything that we want to do in this group seems to be coming together. And this is the human element we are trying to support and help and help businesses understand what the problem is out there. I'm really interested to find out about yourself because you're the independent anti-slavery commissioner. But more importantly, you're a long-term serving police officer. Is that correct?
That's right. I'm no longer a police officer, but okay. You're absolutely right. Your sources are accurate. For 33 years, I was a police officer. I was eventually the Chief Constable of Thames Valley Police. And after that, I chaired the National Police Chiefs Council, so worked with the Chief in Police Scotland, as well as colleagues throughout England, Wales and Northern Ireland.
So that, to me, it shows that you're somebody who's worked your way through the force. It's no mean feat, and you've had a phenomenal career prior to becoming the independent anti-slavery commissioner. And tell me, you must have something. It's like for me when I look at police officers, nurses, because there must be something driving you inside to do the role that you do just now and the role that you did before. What is that? What do you have?
I think I was brought up with a strong sense of public service. I wasn't going to admit this to you, but I was brought up in a vicarage. My father was a minister in the Church of England. And I think that sense, and my mother was a nurse, I shouldn't forget that. And that sense of helping people and being there for others and trying to make a difference was something I guess I was brought up with. So when I was leaving university and thinking about what I might do, I'd automatically kind of focused on the public sector, but had never thought about joining the police. It wasn't something anybody in my family had done. And it was a friend who said, have you thought about the police graduate scheme? And in those days, this was the early 80s, police forces used to run 2 or 3 day courses you could apply for and kind of go on ride-alongs, go out in fast cars, go on patrol, have lots of presentations. And so I went and did that for 2 or 3 days in London. And I thought, wow, this is such an interesting, varied and very challenging role. I'll give it a go. And I guess the rest is history.
Fantastic. Well, what a story. And grew up in a vicarage. Fantastic. There you go. There's a first. So I'll go into I'd like you to go in a bit more detail about the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner and what is your job. It's a big title and it's a big job. I know that, but can you tell me what do you do? What does your office do?
So my job is set out in legislation, in fact, in the Modern Slavery Act 2015. And it's quite straightforward, really. It's to encourage good practice in preventing and detecting Modern Slavery Act offences and in identifying victims. And in order to do that, I've got a pretty free rein. The only 2 things I really have to do is provide the Home Secretary in London with a strategic plan, and she has to consult with the devolved administrations, so in Scotland and Northern Ireland, and then she presents it to Parliament, which she did in October 2019. And the other thing I have to do is every year I have to report on what I've done in my annual report. The same process. I have to present it to the Home Secretary. She speaks to the devolved administrations, and then it gets laid before Parliament. We just did that again in September this year. I have 4 priorities. The first one is about victim support. I'm really concerned about longer term victim support issues, but there's a whole range of activities we do in pursuit of that. Very concerned about criminal justice and that traffickers are brought to justice. The third priority is about preventing modern slavery. And the last one is about making sure we're using research and innovation to improve identifying victims, prevention, and also criminal justice prosecutions. So very, very varied job, which I guess I loved policing because it was varied, and I love this because it's varied too.
That sounds really varied. It goes from one end to the other end, and you're, suppose you're at the pinnacle of what this problem is in our society in the UK and in Scotland. So that's fantastic to hear. You've been in the job for about 18. Now, remember, I work in the recruitment industry, so I've done my background on your CV here, but you've been doing the job for 18 months. So again, not a great length of time, but I'm sure you've learnt a lot. What do you see the biggest challenges are that are coming to you?
No, I think 18 months on, what concerns me is that throughout the United Kingdom, we are identifying more victims, but we're not prosecuting more offenders. And, I really get worried about it. It can't just be about finding more and more people. We've got to think about what can we do to prevent this from happening in the first place. And that's why it's great to be talking to you, because I do think, of course, government have got a role. We've all got a role as citizens and consumers, but business has got a key role to play, I think, in preventing slavery and trafficking.
Absolutely. And that's, that's fantastic to hear, because I see that really, really key. And that's what kind of drives me and drives this grouping, Scotland Against Modern Slavery. And I suppose that kind of leads me on to about modern slavery in business. So there is a risk to all businesses, I would say, of modern slavery coming into your supply chain in the business community. And, I've learned a lot about it over the years and can assess it now myself. What do you think the biggest risks are? And also what's the current responsibilities of businesses with regards to their modern slavery obligations, and also what they should be doing morally too?
Well, a few facts and figures. A few years ago, the International Labour Organization wrote a report on global estimates of the number of people in modern slavery throughout the whole of the world. And they estimated 40 million, of whom 25 million were in labour exploitation. And of those 25 million, 16 million were in labour exploitation in the private sector. So we're talking about 16 million people worldwide. And a lot of the products that we buy in shops or online are sourced from all over the world. It's a globalized economy and we have global supply chains. So we need to be thinking about what's happening when things are being made, thousands of miles away. But we also need to think about supply chains in the UK. It's very easy to say, well, it's about the fishing industry in Thailand, or it's about conflict minerals in West Africa, or it's about, child labour in Indonesia. It's nothing to do with me here in Scotland or England. But in fact, there are cases in both our countries where people have been living in really awful situations in labour exploitation. And one of the examples I might give, I'm sorry, it's an English case, but it was a case from last year, referred to as Operation Fort, where we think about 400 people were trafficked from Poland. Vulnerable people, maybe people who didn't have work, who maybe had been in prison, who had alcohol issues or were in debt, and they were offered the chance of a lifetime. Come to England and have this great, well-paid job. And you've got to decide within the next 24 hours, otherwise the chance will go. And a lot of them took that opportunity. And they worked in farms and in basic manufacturing in a range of companies. They were paid the minimum wage, but they were controlled by the traffickers. They lived in utter squalor, and they would be paid weekly. And these traffickers then would go to their cash accounts on a Friday afternoon and basically empty out the account. They might leave them £20 a week to live on. And the conditions in which they lived were just utterly squalid, just awful. Like one of the guys told me that the mattresses they were sleeping in, they think they were found in the street, they've been chucked out by other people and just left in the street. How one human being can do that to another is beyond me. Anyway, the reason why it was discovered was because these guys were so poor. So they were poor, but they were so hungry. They were going to a soup kitchen, and it was somebody who worked for the church there, who just was himself Polish and befriended them and built up their confidence. And in the end, there was a really significant police investigation, big criminal trial. There's a panorama program about it, and the traffickers were all convicted. And as I say, these guys were working in farms and manufacturing which were tier one suppliers to all the supermarkets you and I will be familiar with. And one of the things that struck us at the time was that we often say that those customer-facing businesses that are concerned about their consumers have often been the best at thinking about supply chains. And also, by the way, agriculture is a regulated sector by the Gangmaster and Labour Abuse Authority. But still, organised crime, through corrupt people in employment agencies, were able to place people in these situations and exploit them. And having met some of the very courageous men who gave evidence at Crown Court, they lived in utter fear of the people who were trafficking them. And what also struck me was that, they were very kind of relieved it was over, but they felt that they had done the right thing, and that they felt it was a really good and important thing that the traffickers have been brought to justice.
And that's the biggest case in the UK ever, wasn't it? Operation Fort.
That's right, in terms of length of time, number of exhibits, witnesses, absolutely a massive case.
Yeah. And it shows you, and this is something I suppose that I guess there's learnings from that, and there's learnings for businesses in that, because you mentioned there was business involved, and there was corruption within those businesses that allowed this to happen. I can only call them evil individuals working for those companies that allowed those recruitment businesses allowed that to happen, allowed those people to be exploited in such a way. How do you, what do you think the learnings are, the lessons are from Operation Fort? Then there must be something that's come out of that.
Well, the most obvious thing is that even the best companies are vulnerable, are susceptible to this sort of organised crime. But what we decided to do after the case had completed, I knew the investigating officers, and we got a very detailed assessment from them about the investigation. And in fact, I know the prosecuting barrister as well, and we talked to her about the case. But I then wrote to all those businesses that were caught up in it and said, you'll be aware of this case because there'd been media coverage, of course. This is a real warning about what can happen in your supply chains. What are you going to do about it? And can you reassure me that you're taking this issue seriously? And they all, to be fair, all wrote back. And we had a series of visits and meetings and looked at their modern slavery statements. And from that, we wrote a report. But we also looked at what we call a maturity framework. We looked at, what are the best companies doing that are taking this really seriously? Going through kind of down 4 levels to what kind of the bare minimum was that some companies were doing. And my view is that writing a modern slavery statement is kind of at minimal compliance level. The very best companies are at board level saying that, human rights matters, that we really do need to engage with our workers, that workers' rights and decent pay and decent working conditions matter, that we are going to work with our supply chains. If we're sourcing from abroad, we're going to work with NGOs and local people on the ground to find out what's going on, to gather the intelligence, to understand whether there is exploitation and abuse in the factories or the fields that we're sourcing from. They're using technology to identify risk, using data analytics to look at all that information they've got in all the systems to say, okay, where are the highest risk sectors, the highest risk areas, and where are we spending a lot of money? So we can then really focus on not just requiring the suppliers to do their own audits, but really drilling down into the supply chain to see what's going on.
That's amazing that you say that, because it's so relevant to what's going on in business. But actually, what I'll take from what you're saying as well is that there's buy-in from the very top of the organisation that has to be put in place. Absolutely.
You need the chief exec to be saying that actually, people and planet matter as much as profit. And it's as simple as that.
Yeah.
And we exist, to solve the world's problems, not to create more problems, not to destroy the planet, not to wreck people's lives, but actually to create good.
Yeah, and absolutely right. And we can't get away from this. I think it's humans, and it's humans, people exploiting people, and it's age old. And at this point in time, the figures that you quoted are far higher. There's a far higher number of people caught in slavery now than there ever was in what we would have known as historic slavery during those brutal times. So to me, this is the scary thing, is it's only getting worse, and it's growing and growing and growing. I'm going to take it back a little bit here, because I'm thinking about in business as well, about the business community and what they could be doing. But also there's been a recent consultation at the UK government level with regards to the Modern Slavery Act, and there's changes coming, changes afoot, that businesses could probably prepare themselves for, or understand a bit more about what's coming. What would your view be on what the changes are and what's going to be happening with regards to the Modern Slavery Act 2015?
So hopefully anybody from business who's listening to this knows that any business with a turnover of more than £36 million a year that's operating in the UK needs to write an annual modern slavery statement. That's a requirement of Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act. There was concern that maybe this was a rather easy bar to cross, and that in fact the requirements needed to be made tougher. There was a consultation by the UK government on that, and they announced about 6 weeks ago that they will look for a bit of legislation to change the requirements. And basically what they're suggesting is three main things. The first is, at the moment there are 6 headings for modern slavery, kind of come up with ways to mitigate the risks, that you have the policies in place. There's a variety of things. And instead of those being advisory, the suggestion is that they should be mandatory. Secondly, there has been talk for a long time that these statements should be sent to a government register. That is going to happen, and that's going to be a requirement that they're uploaded to that register. In terms of sanctions, that's something that they haven't decided what to do about. At the moment, the law says that the Home Secretary can injunct a company to write a modern slavery statement if they haven't done so. That power has never been used in 5 years. There is a lot of concern in the sector that actually this needs a bit more of a tougher sanction regime. The government have kept their powder dry on that. They will be, I think, publishing a report, maybe even legislation in the new year, which will be about how to take forward enforcement of labour regulations. So the future of the Gangmaster and Labour Abuse Authority and the people who deal with minimum wage in HMRC and the Employment Agency Standards, which is part of the business department. So there's some more work in this space, and so they've kind of kicked the decision on sanctions to that piece of work. But I think, a lot of people think that, well, firstly, the Home Secretary has got a power that he or she has never used, which is a missed opportunity, because I can tell you, not all companies that should have a modern slavery statement have got one. But secondly, a view that maybe it needs to be a bit tougher than that.
Yeah, I think that's the understanding, isn't it? The tougher the sanctions, and also, and this is just personally my view, Sarah, is that once this is passed, and if the sanctions are put in place, there will be a big example made of somebody, and that will have to trickle down, and other businesses will have to follow, because it will make big news. And that's just my personal view.
No, I agree with you. I think it would really make a strong statement if the Home Secretary only used the power that she has got at the moment to injunct a company, because you don't have to prosecute many people to really get a lot of others saying, we don't want that to happen to us, and what do we need to do to prevent us from being in that situation. So I think it can have a kind of a massive preventative effect right across business.
Absolutely. And that's a fair point. And another area, and I'm just, when I'm talking about business here and how that looks and how that works, is it's procurement. And procurement has a place to play. Every procurement department or policy or head of procurement in the bigger organisations have a part to play. And many people that I've spoken to through over the last few years, they've maybe asked for advice and guidance and how that should look. But one thing that sticks in my head, and again, it's coming, I work for a recruitment business, and it's Staffline and Brightwork. One of the things we always get asked is, can you do how cheap are your rates? Oh, because they'll do it cheaper than you, and they'll do it cheaper than you. And this is something that's consistently been a thorn in our side for years, because you can't do it cheap, because it's not a cheaply way to run business. So, from a procurement perspective, if they're constantly looking for the cheapest way to do something, I don't believe it's always going to give them the service quality and also protect their brands, which is another point that I'll talk about. So, how do you feel about that, about procurement and what its role is, what that profession's role is to play in this?
So do you remember we said that the leadership of a business has a key role? I think the human resources department has a key role, but the key people are, whether you call them procurement or commercial, some businesses call them, they are absolutely key as they're looking to make arrangements to sign contracts with subcontractors and suppliers. And I think the point that you make about price is really important. It's one of the things that I've been talking to people in the textile industry about recently, because you might have heard about the issue about the company Boohoo.
Yes.
And the report that was published by a lawyer who was commissioned by Boohoo about what had been happening in Leicester over the summer. And one of the things that made me realise, reading through Alison Levitt's report, is that what the buyers were focusing on all the time was price, and it had to be the lowest price possible. What they weren't able to do, she says, is actually think about what the cost of making this was. So, okay, you negotiate somebody, I don't know, down to £8 for a dress, but the cost of labour, material, logistics, storage, packaging, labelling, you just can't do it for £8. And so, it's not just about the price, as you say, it's about realistically, if you're thinking about the cost of making this, how can you factor in at least minimum wage level labour and it to be that price? So I think you're absolutely right that often the focus is on price, but actually, good buying, you should be really thinking about all those elements and how do we factor in the true cost of labour where people are rewarded properly for decent work. Because if we're not doing that, we are really... People can't maybe shortcut on the cost of the material or on logistics or branding. They're going to be shortcutting on labour costs. And so that's how you end up with people being paid £3.50 an hour.
Yeah, that's the frightening part of it. You're absolutely right. Now, the podcast and the group in Scotland Against Modern Slavery, there is a specific element to this of Scotland, and that's the angle I focus in on. And we've seen a massive increase of victims rescued through the NRM, the National Referral Mechanism, in 2019 in comparison to 2018. 125% more victims. So it went from 217, I believe, victims up to 512 in a year. And the NGOs that we work with in the charity Migrant Help have, quite clear that the amount of victims through the COVID period, it seems at a similar level. So that number hasn't dropped at all. What is driving this? Because it's similar figures, it's in line with the rest of the UK proportionately. So what's driving this? Why is there such a big increase?
So before lockdown, before COVID, when I was allowed to travel...
Well, you're freezing up a second there.
My first year.
You're back.
But I spent some time, talking to police officers, clearly talking to government officials, charities, lots of different people, lawyers, universities, judges. So that was all good. What I observed at the beginning was that the numbers in Scotland were lower proportionately than England and Wales. Okay. And so I wanted to understand why that was. And then throughout the course of the year, they began to rise and rise. And I think that one of the reasons they were lower is because you were not identifying as many cases of child criminal exploitation. Now, I think that's beginning to change. There are different views. Some people argued that most child criminal exploitation is around the drug markets, and they argued that, in fact, drug markets in Scotland were different than drug markets in England and Wales. I'm not sure that's the case, yeah. And I think what you're beginning to find is now people are more aware of criminal exploitation of children. There are more cases. But the other thing that had happened in Scotland this time last year was the number of Vietnamese victims being identified had really shot up. And because of that, I do know that there are a couple of Vietnamese officers working closely with Police Scotland, and I'm shortly to meet with them, I think, next week. So I think there are different reasons in different parts of the country, but I think what's driven your rise is a better understanding of criminal exploitation, and I think some of the trafficking that's happening from other countries, and as I say, the Vietnamese numbers were quite stark.
Yeah. Okay.
In terms of lockdown, your experience of the numbers going down in lockdown, very similar to the rest of the country. I think that's not at all because there was less trafficking or slavery. I think that the sorts of people who respond to it, whether that's police officers or social workers or other people in kind of border force, they just weren't out and about as much, or they weren't focusing on slavery. They were doing other COVID-related acts. So I think it was more that people were coming into contact with the authorities rather than there was less slavery trafficking. And that's when, as things come out of lockdown, then you begin to have the numbers going back to where they were.
I'd had a chat with Detective Superintendent Phil Capaldi from Police Scotland, who heads up the anti-trafficking unit, and he echoed what you said. You know, efforts were elsewhere, but what his concern was that as labour was becoming more scarce, then the commoditisation of human labour was going up. So he felt there's a risk associated with it because people were less visible during that first lockdown, which is really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a case of hidden harm, and I think also the case, you know, when we eventually get round to coming out of lockdown, you know, the pressure on people who maybe are undocumented, who maybe were working in the gig economy, in insecure work, to take any sort of work because it's the best opportunity, and to take exploitative work, I think is a real risk. But also I think employers who've been really struggling, you know, will be very tempted to cut corners, to take risks with people. And that's what we've got to be absolutely on our guard for when we begin to move out of this difficult period.
You're absolutely right. Well, you know, as we're kind of coming to a close, I see the opportunity of raising awareness in Scotland because we're a small nation, and as a small nation, we have a population around 6 million. We have access to business, access to government. It's all, to me, it seems to be a lot more coherent. But as a smaller nation in the UK, what do you think as the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner? What could we be doing to gel it together, to get this moving, to get the groundswell going, pushing further and further on?
Okay. Well, first, let me say something about Scotland, because what's always struck me when I've been there and sort of working in this job is that you have such an advantage, that you have very good relationships in terms of your partnerships. The meetings I've been to where you've got charities, NGOs, advocacy groups, police officers, government officials all around the table. I think there's a sense of purpose and collaborative endeavour, which I think is brilliant. And also because it's much smaller, you all seem to know each other, and that seems to be a great advantage. So you're in a kind of great place kind of in that regard. I think the other thing I'd say is, you know, of course government's got a role, and we spent a lot of time talking about business having a role, but we all have a role, I think, as citizens and as consumers, to be concerned about protecting the most vulnerable from exploitation and the way in which we might unwittingly contribute to their exploitation. And I sometimes say, you know, if sometimes we knew just how close we were to the exploitation of another, we'd feel very uncomfortable. So it's about thinking twice about, you know, very cheap nail bars, very cheap hand car washes. You know, how can those services be provided and people paid a proper wage? Might they be kind of in debt bondage? Might they be, paid minimally and not really free to leave? But also I think it's, you know, when we're just buying stuff, whether it's in shops, online, you know, just thinking about, actually, could this, you know, if this is too good to be true, if it's such a steal, well, maybe that's because a child labourer, a prison labourer, somebody who's paid, you know, very poorly in very poor conditions and isn't free to leave, maybe they are the ones who made what we like the look of, and we should just think twice before we buy. Because I think if we all did that, it could make a real difference.
Absolutely. Consumer power. You've been an absolute delight. We've covered so many different topics about yourself, about procurement practice, about the vicarage, about the changes to the Modern Slavery Act that are coming, about Scotland as a nation, about what we can do, about procurement practice as well, and the biggest case, Operation Fort. So thank you so much for your time. I know you're very, very busy, so we're delighted to have you and speak to us so openly. So thank you, Dame Sarah Thornton. Thank you very much.
Thank you, my pleasure.